be hearing from Dr. Ed Arnett and Aaron Bearwald. Dr. Arnett is Director for the Center for Responsible Energy Development at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, where he oversees policy and conservation aspects of energy development and impacts on fish and wildlife. He led research efforts on bats and wind energy development at Bat Conservation International for 8 years and serves as a science advisor for the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative, the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative, and the American Wind Wildlife Institute. Aaron Bearwald is a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. During both her master's and her current PhD, she has studied and published extensively on the effects of wind energy development on bats. She is the 2014 recipient of the American Society of Mammalogists William T. Hornaday Award for her significant contribution as a student to conservation of mammals and their habitat. And with that, we'll turn things over to Ed and Aaron. So take it away, guys.
Thanks very much, Ian, and good afternoon to all, or good morning, depending on whether you're Pacific or Mountain, as Jeff mentioned. And I, too, also noticed a number of folks, so a virtual welcome to reconnect with a number of people. Erin tooted her own horn there in her bio, but I did want to give a shout-out to her for sure on her prestigious award from the American Society of Mammalogists on the William T. Hornaday Award. So I was planning to do that anyway, Erin, and I do want to acknowledge her extensive work and her co-authorship with us on this chapter that we're going to discuss. What we were asked to do was to give a summary of our synthesis chapter that was published in Bat Evolution, Ecology, and Conservation. This book, if you don't have it, is available. It was edited by Rick Adams and Scott Pedersen through Springer. And our chapter was on the impacts of wind energy development on bats, implications for conservation, which is the title of this talk. We're going to go through a number of things. I'm going to give you some background information. We'll talk a little bit about estimates of fatality, some patterns, a variety of different patterns, a little bit about offshore, spend some time on mitigation, and then discuss some conclusions and next steps. Aaron and I are going to tag team this and just kind of go back and forth. So with that, let's start off with a little background. And I think a number of you that are on the call have probably heard this over and over again. So stay tuned. There are a few bits and pieces that are new. So, but for those of you that haven't heard this, welcome to the background on bats and wind energy. Bats really were not noted or an issue until exactly 10:30 a.m. On August 19, 2003, when my friend and colleague Jim Lindsay got a call from Windsmiths at the Mountaineer facility, and that was the exact moment that we had an issue with bats and wind energy. Also, about the same time, I believe Jenny's on the call. Work was ongoing at the Tennessee Valley Authority site, and those two facilities really kind of kicked off an issue that has now developed worldwide. In 2003 at the Mountaineer facility, somewhere between 1,400 and 4,000 bats were estimated to have been killed in that year, and that subsequent year following these kills and these events in the eastern U.S., we formed the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative with Bat Conservation International, the American Wind Energy Association, the Department of Energy, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Those partners that lead the BWEC have now expanded to USGS, Department of Energy, and others that are now participating. And since that time, we've conducted very intensive studies on post-construction fatality, bat interactions with turbines, pre-construction assessments, and operational mitigation and deterrence. A lot of different things have been going on since that initial finding in 2003. And about the same time, Dr. Robert Barkley, who was a member of the science team of the BWEC and still is, picked up this young lady, Miss Erin Bearwald, out there outstanding in her field, or kneeling in her field. Erin started her important pioneering work in Canada with Dr. Barkley at the University of Calgary. So that's when it really kicked off. And a lot of the consulting firms, many of whom are on the call, had been doing work on bats and are still doing so today. So lots of things have been going on. Well, there have been an increasing number of studies, as Jeff noted, a lot of peer-reviewed literature that was once depauperate and almost non-existent is now starting to take off. This is just a sample. These are all available at the Bats and Wind Energy website. I don't have that listed, but it's batsandwind.org. Also wanted to give a shout to Dr. Chris Hine, who took over the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative after I departed BCI, well, even before I departed BCI, and is continuing to lead the BWEC efforts. A lot of things have been published, and more to come in the coming years. Part of the background, let's talk a little bit about some of the possible explanations. And we won't hit on this too hard. There was a very nice publication by Cryan and Barkley that followed a paper that Tom Kuntz and myself and several others put out on questions and hypotheses about turbine kills. Cryan and Barkley did a very nice paper that followed on and defined proximate causes as to how the animals were actually killed, and then the ultimate causes as to why. It can be random chance events, coincidental during migration, or a variety of attraction hypotheses that have been put out and put forth and still remain today. Of course, one of our favorites, particularly as it relates to tree bats, this is the roost attraction hypothesis, also mating hypothesis of tall structures in the landscape. But this, for those that haven't seen this slide before in this presentation, this is what a turbine might look like during the day, or does look like during the day. This is what it might look like in the evening. And this happens to be a ponderosa pine snag down in southern Arizona. So you can see some of the similarities and the potential for the roost attraction hypothesis to in fact be real. It doesn't explain the fatalities for things like Brazilian free-tailed bats, for example, but it certainly may be a reasonable hypothesis as to the roost attraction, a place to secure food, rest, or a mate, perhaps. The mate attraction hypothesis also is gaining some recognition, and there are in fact some new studies that are indicating that roost attraction, those hypotheses may explain the fatalities. Again, at least for the migrating tree bats, these are some publications that are forthcoming. Regardless of what the attraction factor is, it's critically important to know these biological mechanisms and how fatalities may occur, but most particularly if they lead us to a solution. At the end of the day, the bats are dead. And the reason why they are killed may or may not lead us to solutions. Some may and some may not, but I just challenge researchers to think carefully about digging into some of the biological studies if they're not really going to lead us to any solutions. So, and we'll talk about that more later.
So, as Ed already mentioned, we talk about the attraction hypothesis and we talk about migratory tree bats. But not just migratory tree bats are being killed. Of the 47 species of bats that occur north of Mexico, we've now found 21 of those at turbines. But the fatalities are heavily skewed towards migratory tree bats. About 78% of all fatalities in North America are of migratory tree bats, which are hoary bats, eastern red bats, and silver-haired bats. However, there are some sites, particularly in the eastern and Midwest U.S., that 60% of fatalities can be comprised of little brown bats and include big brown bats as well as tricolored bats. And in the Southwest U.S., where Brazilian blue caps are common, they can also be commonly found with mortality. And to date, 2 endangered species have been found at wind facilities, and those include Indian red bats and Hawaiian hoary bats. Now, it's important to emphasize here that only 2 of these species have been found. We have a picture of a lesser long-nosed bat, which is an endangered species. And there are some unconfirmed reports from Mexico that these species now have been found in endangered facilities in Mexico. So we don't know what the future is going to look like. We don't know, given the expansion of wind, what other endangered species we'll find. And we also don't know what the future will look like with future species listings. So we know that little brown bats, tricolored bats, and the northern long-eared bats are heavily affected by white nose syndrome. And in both Canada and the U.S., they've been proposed to be listed as endangered. We don't know what then the cumulative impact of white nose and wind fatalities will be for these species. We do know that we're concerned because the bulk of the species experiencing the highest fatalities have little or no protection, especially these long-distance migrants that move across political boundaries. And we know that many of these species are already in decline, such as Asian red bats, as we mentioned, the little brown bats and the tricolored bats, which can be killed quite frequently at turbines. And we know that turbines are not just killing juveniles. They're primarily killing prime breeding age adults. And we know that bats breed very slowly. They have very slow life histories. They have 1 to 2. In the case of Eastern red bats, they may have 4. But they breed very slowly, 1 to 2 to 4 pups a year, and not every year. So this makes them very prone to population declines and very slow to recover. So while we don't know what the impact on the population will be, there is a lot of concern about the cumulative impact as wind energy expands. So the big question that we have is, can these species of bats sustain such rates of additive mortality when considering cumulative effects? So not just fatalities from wind energy, but now also fatalities from white nose.
So one of the things that we did in our book chapter was try to estimate cumulative fatalities, and one of the things that we wanted to share here was the distribution of wind energy. This is the distribution in Canada. You can see as of June 2013, the distribution heavily skewed in Ontario, second by, and then followed by a number of different provinces. Some would have very, very little. Alberta in the far west has the most installed capacity. So this is the distribution of wind energy in the U.S. Most of you are quite familiar with this. Of course, everything having to be bigger in Texas. Texas leads the way. The point here is that there's an uneven distribution of the installation of facilities where the capacity is and such, so therefore there's also could be an uneven distribution of fatalities, some region having more than others. And what we tried to do was account for that in an analysis. So with this uneven distribution of the facilities as well as the studies, our approach was to take a look at how those regional bat fatalities from studies in these different areas. Now, what had happened prior to this, back when I published a paper in 2008, we did some pretty darn simple math and calculated a continental average of about 12 bats per megawatt. And that was simply taking the studies that had been reported, and I have to qualify this real quickly because Jeff did probably a much better job of sticking to the peer-reviewed science. I think we would have been narrowed down to about 2 publications at that time. So we did look at the gray literature reports. Our criteria were the estimates that were reported in the studies had to account for searcher efficiency and carcass removal at the very least, so they were corrected estimates and not just raw estimates. This particular graph borrowed from my friend and colleague Wally Erickson. This was from, I believe, the last time we held a NWCC research committee. Wally used this particular slide to show the distribution of studies and estimated fatalities per megawatt in these different regions. And we wanted to take this just a little bit further. We basically went into the literature, and I apologize for my lovely GIS skills. I know some friends that are sitting there laughing right now as we speak. But basically, we had a couple of graduate students that I was working with and still am working with at Texas Tech University, and we said we'd like to break down the continental U.S. and Canada into major vegetative zones where we can stratify and parse out where the installed capacity is and then look at the studies. So we defined these regions that were delineated based on these very coarse vegetative conditions, came up with 10 zones, and then looked at where the installed capacity was, and also looked at the research. From that, are the reports that were available and reported fatalities. So what we wanted to do is calculate a mean bats killed per region, as expressed as bats per megawatt in that region, and this is what that looks like. Well, that's not what that looks like. These are our assumptions. The assumptions were, in this coalescing of these great literature and peer-reviewed publications, was that the fatality rates in those defined regions were representative of the facilities in a given region, and that fatality rates are constant from year to year without mitigation or behavioral modification. Those are the two most important assumptions. The other thing is that we have to remember that, of course, the reported fatality rates are, of course, conditioned on how those estimates, how the data were gathered, the sampling protocols, and how they were estimated, which estimator they used, and how searcher efficiency and carcass removal were accounted for. So it's a pretty messy data set, as you might imagine, but quite frankly, the only way to do a true meta-analytic approach to this is to have the raw data and run all the numbers through the same analysis, and we just have not been able to get to that at this point in time due to data sharing and other issues. So these were our assumptions. Again, another caution on the numbers and the fatality rates being conditioned, but these were what our regional bat fatalities looked like for the 6 regions that at that time, as of 2011, had studies reported either in a publicly available grade literature report or in the peer-reviewed literature. So this was, again, the range of those bat fatalities. Then what we wanted to do was to calculate, do a weighted mean approach. We wanted to develop this weighted mean by region and its installed capacity, and then sum that to calculate cumulative fatalities for the U.S. and Canada. We started that in 1999, but the actual projected estimate starts from 2000 and runs through 2001. And based on our analysis, the mean fatalities over that 12-year period was a little over 1.2 million, and the range was 840,000 or so to nearly 1.7 million. Now, again, back to the assumptions. This assumes that those fatalities are constant from one year to the next. We know they don't grow linear in a perfect linear fashion, but we do assume that those, and I think it's a fair assumption, that the studies that are reflected by region do reflect the fatalities in a particular given region. And we also know that no one's really conducting mitigation broad scale. There are efforts ongoing at a number of different facilities, but not widespread operational mitigation. The deterrents are not yet ready for prime time, but and we don't have any evidence to suggest that there's behavioral modification of the bats. In some facilities, we have seen declines in second and third year of data collection. In other years, it goes up the third year after going down the second, so there's quite a bit of variability there. So again, this doesn't necessarily reflect, this obviously grows with the increasing installed capacity. It's not 100% linear, but we don't have anything to suggest that the studies that we've included in our synthesis would be unrepresentative of what's going on in that particular region, or that there's been behavioral modification or extensive mitigation. So this is, again, the installed capacity through 2012. We did our study through 2011, and this would have been our estimate for fatalities in 2012, somewhere between 196,000 and nearly 396,000 killed in one given year, again, based on the assumptions. So the point is, I think that, regardless of the fatality estimate and the accumulation, a lot of bats are being killed, and we need to mitigate those effects where it makes sense to do so.
There are a lot of bats being killed, and we see that they're being killed across the U.S. and Canada. And we have been able to, by going through the literature, find some patterns that are associated with these fatalities, about temporal, spatial, and patterns of habitat and weather and other environmental variables. So some of the temporal patterns, and this hasn't changed in years since the issue first became apparent, that the bulk of the fatalities occur during autumn. So in the northern latitudes, from mid-July through to October. But there is yearly variation. So you can see in the bottom left here a graph from France. And we see 3 years of fatality plotted here. And we see an earlier peak in 2004 than we do in 2003 and 2005. So although the fatalities peak in the autumn, there may be yearly variation, which really does highlight the need for multi-year studies. We do know, too, that there does not appear to be killer turbines on the site, so fatalities tend to be distributed among the turbines. If we have a turbine with particularly high fatality rates one year, it may not have the highest fatality rate the next year. There is some data that turbines in the northern end of the farm may have higher fatality rates than turbines at the southern end of the farm. And especially at northern latitudes like we have in Alberta, that may be related to the north-south migration route. That bats are killed more frequently at turbines they first encounter. There is, again, some evidence coming from Alberta that there is a landscape level pattern. What we found here was that fatality and activity rates were higher at facilities that were closer to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Which you can see the Rocky Mountains on the left side of the picture there, and the facilities circled were the ones with higher rates relative to the ones out the west, out to the east, of the prairies. And we do know that bats have been found in a wide variety of habitats worldwide. So that doesn't seem to be an issue of just forest ridgetops or just mixed agriculture or just prairies. It's all over. But we do tend to find a lack of consistent patterns with habitat. So in the picture on the left, the arrow, at one site we may find that fatalities are higher at turbines closer to water sources, but that pattern breaks down when we look at other sites. So far there's no consistent relationship, tends to be very site specific. But something that is consistent is the pattern of bat fatalities with wind speeds. Numerous studies have found that bat fatalities are higher when wind speeds are lower. So here's just an example of a graph from the Mountaineer facility in West Virginia. And we have fatality index, which is a measure of fatality rate on the Y, and percentage of night with the wind speed is greater than 6 meters per second on the X. And we see that as wind speed increases, fatality rates decrease. And again, we see this again and again. Some of the other patterns we see with fatalities and weather and environmental factors, we see influence of temperature. So we tend to see that fatality rates are higher in higher temperatures, and that fatality rates are lower in high rains or high relative humidity. We also see an influence of barometric pressure, of moon illumination, and bat activity.
Okay, so we wanted to spend just a little bit of time on offshore and nearshore wind and bats. There's not a lot of information. Some of the first information that came out was from our colleague Ingemar Lean, who noted that bats follow coastlines in the fall and appear to concentrate at points before they migrate out over the ocean. And Ingemar and colleagues were able to find about 11 species that go out to sea, and they believe they were foraging. But they also happen to observe bats roosting on nacelles offshore. So that's really one of the only publications relative to offshore wind facilities. There have been some new studies that have been published in the last few years. One very recently this year, noting here in the U.S. 6 species detected offshore. You can kind of read the list there: hoary bats, eastern reds, and others. I think the point there is that they do use shorelines. And the activity seems to be associated with those migratory periods, which is corroborates almost all the various evidence that we seem to have about those migration periods and weather patterns and such, including increased activity during low wind speeds and higher temperatures. But the one key point here, I think, for folks to remember is that offshore issues may have some similarities as to what we find onshore, but they're different ecologically, and only some of the information onshore can be really is fair to transfer to offshore facilities. So we need to not necessarily assume the same things. So there are going to be the needs for research and mitigation. The problem, of course, is post-construction monitoring would seemingly be a hopeless task, as we just really don't have methods for doing those kinds of surveys yet. So it really highlights the importance of pre-construction assessments.
So some of the mitigation options, as Ed just said, one of the primary ones is this pre-construction assessment to determine and avoid areas that may be high risk for bat fatalities. Other things we can look at to mitigate fatalities is operational mitigation. So we can curtail turbine operation during high-risk periods, especially if these high-risk periods are predictable. We can also use technology to mitigate. We could potentially deter or alert the bats to the risk that turbines pose. So one of the first ideas that we had to mitigate turbines was to alter the cut-in speed of turbines to reduce fatality of bats. So cut-in speed is the lowest wind speed at which turbine-generated electricity enters the power grid. The turbine starts to ramp up to speed and push that electricity into the grid. The manufacturer's cut-in speed for most modern turbines is about 3.5 to 4 meters per second. We can raise the cut-in speed of each turbine, and then the blades remain pitched out to parallel the wind, and they can freewheel, but they move very, very slowly. And there's some evidence that this may be effective to mitigate fatalities. We know from thermal imaging work that Horn et al. Did in 2008 that bats do not frequently strike stationary objects. We also know this from hundreds of years of research from communication towers in lighthouses and buildings, that although bats do occasionally collide with non-moving objects, it happens relatively rarely relative to birds. And we know that a large percentage of bat kills occur on low wind nights when energy production is marginal. And we know that there's higher activity of bats during low wind periods. We've already shown some of that data. So we know that when wind speeds are about under 6 meters per second, energy production is low, and so is bat activity. So we set out to test this. In 2006 and 2007, we altered the cut-in speed of turbines at one of our facilities in Alberta, and we found a reduction of about 60% in kills. Then Ed Arnett and fellows at BWEC followed that and altered the cut-in speed at a facility in the northeastern United States, and they reduced fatalities by between 44 and 93% by increasing the cut-in speed between 5 and 6.5 meters per second with minimal power loss. Since then, there have been multiple studies follow up. A couple of studies in Fowler Ridge, Indiana, that increased the cut-in speed to 5 to 6.5, and followed up with increases from 4.5 to 5.5, and all of those reduced bat fatalities. Another study from Mount Strong that found the same thing.
So this is from a paper that has been submitted on a synthesis of curtailment studies, and it's a bit of a messy graph, but I wanted to show you this, in particular the upper left-hand corner. So what this is a compilation of what happens during normal operation, curtailment below 3 meters a second, 4 meters a second, and so on and so forth, as you see throughout the panels. It's the proportion of the time when blade tip speeds exceed 50 miles per hour, or 22.4 meters per second. On the y-axis and the x-axis is the wind speed. The hashed lines that you can see in each panel represent the cut-in speed that we chose to document in that particular panel. So what I want you to focus on, and again, there are a lot of assumptions here. We assume we don't really know what the lethal blade tip speed is or overall blade speed is. So we had to make some assumptions and pick a speed. We chose 50 miles an hour, and not necessarily based on much background or information on that, but chose 50, thinking that certainly would have the potential to kill a bat if it hit it. And what I want you to look at is that upper left-hand corner. The reason I call this the low-hanging fruit is pretty simple. If you look at the amount of time that those blade tips are moving below cut-in, what you see from these various turbines, these lines represent different turbines that are different years of study, but there are different turbines associated here. And below cut-in speed, those blades can be moving up to almost 100% of the time. And you'd expect that because they're ramping up to that cut-in speed. But the point is that there's an opportunity here to perhaps feather the blades up to the manufacturer's cut-in speed and thus the low-hanging fruit. We saw at least one study that was conducted. This was part of the Mount Storm study that demonstrated between 44 and 72% reduction in fatalities when blades were feathered up to the normal cut-in speed. Now, the caveat here is, in a retroactive sense, is not all the turbines can do this. But for those turbines that are capable of being pitched out of the wind from a control center, or easily in some way, shape, or form where you don't have to climb the turbine or go to each turbine every night, we suggest that this is an opportunity that operators take advantage of. The other piece of mitigation research that I was involved with almost from day one back in 2005 or 06, since we started the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative, people were asking us about the magic bat whistle, of course, similar to the deer whistle, some way to deter the animals away. So we've been asking this question. This is an age-old slide I've used 1,000 times. Asking the question, can we generate a disorienting or uncomfortable airspace around turbines that will deter bats? We're not going to get into a lot of detail on this just for time's sake. We want to leave lots of time for questions and such, but we've been working on this with Dr. Joe Suzak from Humboldt State, worked with a couple of different engineers through the years, and now some of this research is taking off and going other directions. But the idea is to generate acoustic broadcasts in the ultrasonic level, and what we chose to do was utilize a broadband ultrasound emission in the 20 to 100 kilohertz range, and instead of picking a specific frequency to blast, we also used a constant emission as opposed to pulsing. There's all kinds of ways that you can do this, and it really comes down to your experimental design and sample size and how many experimental turbines you have relative to your controls and your different kinds of treatments. So the more treatments you add, the more turbines you need, and the more the cost goes up. This was, at that time anyway, a very expensive product to manufacture and a study to conduct. We started out with a number of different smaller devices. Many of you have heard my jokes about this, but I'll just leave them out for this particular webinar. But we started out small with single speaker units, then went to an octagonal 8-speaker system, and the last deterrent that has been tested at present, there are others under development, but this particular one was the one that we tested, a 16-speaker system that was created by Deaton Engineering as part of the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative work. This was done at Locust Ridge in Pennsylvania. And what we found was that for the first year of study, we demonstrated 21 to 51% fewer fatalities at those turbines with deterrent devices compared to control turbines. In the second year of study, when we factored in some of the inherent variation associated from turbine to turbine, we documented 2% more kills and up to 64% fewer bats killed at the treatment turbines in 2010. This was published in PLOS One last year, and that's where the research stands at this point for this particular device. Other devices are being developed, and this particular one has also been, a couple of our older devices were tested by Dr. Gareth Jones in Europe. They were able to demonstrate that they could deter bats from occupying churches and other buildings. Joe Suzak's done a little work on bridges and kind of an eviction deterrent away from bridges and buildings. So this really comes down to an issue of scale, which is part of the problem in terms of coverage and attenuation. Ultrasound attenuates very, very quickly, and it gets real expensive real fast to try and get full coverage. Because of that attenuation, we tried to stack those speakers in a box and pinpoint the emissions. You can see these particular. I'm going to try this and see if I get in trouble with my little pointer here. Oh, I can't grab it, Lauren. Oh well. You can see the boxes up off the nacelle. They were aimed down at the tower. We obviously do not have complete coverage of the nacelle or of the airspace surrounding the blades. In the perpendicular plane, we may be in reasonable shape. In the parallel plane, it's going to be really difficult because those higher frequencies attenuate so quickly. As an aside, there's some pretty interesting videography work that's been done by Dr. Paul Cryan with USGS here in Fort Collins. He's worked with Chris at, I believe it was at Fowler Ridge and some other places on Hawaii and such, where they've been able to document patterns of search patterns and approach patterns, if you will, of the bats. There's my little thing. And what they're finding is that in certain wind conditions, the bats approach the lee side of the turbine. Now, this isn't published yet. I believe it's about to come out. But I think the point here is that if we can pinpoint a particular pattern of approach to the turbines, we might be able to take deterrents, even the existing ones, which have a lot of issues still with water, weatherproofing in hurricane force type winds and rainstorms and such. There's a lot to work to do there yet, but you might be able to pinpoint the directionality of that and reduce fatalities even more. The other option, of course, is to build a better mousetrap, and there are engineers that have been working on this. I know Chris is continuing to work on it at BCI. GE's doing some work, and there's I believe Department of Energy is also looking to fund some work on this to continue. I think my continued cautionary note, though, is we still do not have a functional operating device that has or is being deployed at operating facilities to date. Again, more R&D and experimentation is underway, and we're continuing to design better prototypes. And really, whether this will achieve the goal of mitigation at the same level as curtailment remains to be seen. Aaron?
So you can tell that we have been learning a lot since the issue first became apparent in 2005, early in that 2003. We've really learned a lot, but there's still so much farther to go. So where do we go next? So we have well-lens evidence to support that bat fatalities can be mitigated. But what we need to do is continue to fine-tune that curtailment. So we need to figure out a way to maximize the number of bat kills reduced, to maximize the reduction, while minimizing the cost. And we need to implement this curtailment broadly at sites with moderate to high kills. There are currently some energy companies and sites that are voluntarily mitigating, but we really do need to implement this more broadly. So we need to further develop and test those deterrent devices that Ed was talking about. And we need to determine both their biological and cost effectiveness. So just how effective are they in reducing fatalities? What sort of effects do they have on other biological entities in the area? And how much do they cost? Producing the very loud ultrasonic sounds can be quite expensive. And we need to continue studies to determine which high-risk sites that should be avoided. So to do that, we really need to address some of these priority questions. We need to do it sooner rather than later. We need to figure out the relationship between activity and fatality patterns. So what drives up that activity rate? And how does that influence fatality rate? What is the relationship between pre-construction activity monitoring and post-construction fatality monitoring? We need to understand that migratory patterns. Are they using clear, defined migratory routes, or are they distributed more broadly on the landscape? How predictable are they? We need to understand the use of stopover sites, particularly for areas of the Great Lakes region, where they may congregate in places like Long Point or Port Pelee, or along the coastlines where they may congregate before they go over the ocean. So we need to really understand some of that movement patterns to help us inform where we place wind energy facilities. And we also really need to understand what impacts these fatalities are having on a population. So what context are these fatalities in the background? What are their natural mortality rates? What are the population levels? What are these cumulative impacts? We have to stop looking at fatality rates in isolation at a site-by-site way. We need to be looking at a more regional level. As you showed some slides of where wind farms are distributed across the landscape, it does see that risk is not distributed equally. Turbines are not distributed equally, neither is risk. So some populations may be at higher risk than other populations. And we need to understand this sort of thing. So these are some of our main questions that we can address both with environmental consultant work and in the gray literature, also in the published literature.
And just to add really quickly before we dedicate this to our friends, I just want to add that I have been seeking updates to the population questions. So if anyone on the call is working on this or has new information, send me a note personally or Aaron, or tell Lauren right now, because to my knowledge, we haven't made much in the way of advancement of estimating populations. The genetics work that has been done and has been presented at BWEC workshops and such is still in the making. So we still don't. I got in an interesting discussion over the weekend with someone about how the numbers don't mean much without context, and we don't disagree. It's just we still have not made the advancements in terms of determining, in particular, tree bats. So if anybody has any new information or updates, please share with the group.
We are having a large meeting, Ed, before the bat. We are having a meeting in October before the bat meeting to discuss this exact issue. So we'll keep everybody updated.
Great. And with that, we most certainly wanted to call out some friends that have influenced both Aaron and I. I started working with Andy Linehan a long time ago when this all started, and we started the Bats of Wind Energy Cooperative, and I think most know Andy. If you don't, you should. He was a great developer and a great guy, and really got our study off and running. Dave Riddell and I started some of the first studies that were really trying to connect the dots between pre-construction assessment and post-construction fatalities, and both those two friends lost their battles with cancer. And our friend Dr. Tom Kuntz, he is Doc Kuntz, I made a slip there, but Dr. Kuntz had an accident several years ago now, back in October of 2011, but I think most people, whoever agree or disagree with him, he is certainly one of the most preeminent scientists in the bat world ever, and he is recovering pretty well. And I stay in touch with him a little bit, but we definitely gave Dr. Kuntz a shout out, as he influenced a lot of our thinking and a lot of our movement on the wind issue. And with that, I'll let Erin say her thanks too, but I really appreciate everybody's attention and continued work on this. I know a lot of you on the list here are working on this, and we all appreciate your efforts for trying to move this forward and balance development with our critters out there.
All right, anything you want to say to close, Erin?
I don't think so, other than any Canadians in the audience. Thank you for being here in Canada Day. And I apologize for my echo.
Oh, not to worry. Well, thank you very much, and apologies, we did not realize that it was Canada Day, but
That's okay. I
thanks
get
for
to go
those
from
who are
there and have a beer.
able to join us anyway. We have a lot of questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them. If we don't get to your question, we'll do our best to follow up afterwards. So I'm going to start with some more kind of clarification questions that should be quick. One is going back to the acoustic deterrent slide, and I'm going to see if we can pull that up. Do you remember about where it is? Let's see.
Slide 43 and 44?
Let's see. Yeah, it was the one with the number.
45.
Here we go. Yeah. So if you could just clarify the second bullet there about the 2% more and what those numbers mean again.
The bigger confidence interval, more variation. So in that second year, the first year, we did not account for what turned out to be about a 9.5–10% difference in variation from one turbine to the next. So ultimately, we would have been able to go in and do fatality estimates before the deterrent study occurred and determine if there was some inherent variability from one set of turbines to the next, and we didn't do that in the first year. The second year, we did account for that in our analysis, but regardless, all that represents is just a broader confidence interval. So it's 2% more bats. The range of difference between the treatment and control turbines was 2% more to 64% fewer between treatment and control turbines.
Great, thank you. Okay, and this one is going back towards the beginning, I think when you were talking about fatalities overall, and asking whether the mean of fatalities from 2000 to 2011 is about 1 million per year, or whether that's total over the 11 years. If that makes sense.
Well, it's accumulative over the 12 years.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, some broader questions. This question is asking about how robust the evidence is that you showed that eastern red bats are in decline.
So the evidence does come from peer-reviewed literature, and it's predominantly based on multiple lines of evidence, actually. Capture rate, its acoustic detection, and actually submission to the CDC for rabies testing. And so there is evidence from those lines of evidence that eastern red bats have been declining.
There's surrogate
and
measures.
we have.
All we have. Sorry, Aaron.
Yeah, oh, that's okay. Yes, those surrogate measures are what we have, and the references are listed there on slide 13.
Great, thank you. This question is asking if you can elaborate on the lesser long-nosed bat interactions in Mexico, and if there's any information on that available.
Well, this comes from presentation that I've seen Rafael Vegas Petraca give a couple of different times, and in conversations with him and our colleague, other colleagues in Mexico, that Rodrigo Medellin, who's on our science committee as well, that there have been documented fatalities of lesser long-nosed bats. I think the point there is that there are a handful of other species of bats that are also on the threatened and endangered species list or state listed that could, northern yellow bat, southern yellow bat, I believe, or Texas state listed, but there's a handful of others that as the development expands into the range, we might anticipate that there could be some fatalities. That was the point. To my knowledge, in Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, the very little part of Texas where falls in the range of the lesser longnose, I have not seen a recorded fatality across the border.
Thank you. Let's see. This question is asking about siting wind projects outside of high-risk bat areas and whether you can define what makes an area high risk.
Ed or I? So there is a lot of work.
PhD candidate to me.
There is a lot of work going on by a lot of people trying to identify exactly this. We do know that fatality rates are influenced by activity rates, but we don't yet fully understand the relationship between pre-construction activity and post-construction, especially if turbines attract bats, if that makes sense. So you may detect X number of bats in pre-construction, but if the turbines attract the bats, then fatality rates may actually be higher than anticipated. But we do know that there is a relationship between activity and fatality. If there are more bats available to be killed, there tends to be more bats killed. So if we can site facilities in areas where bat activity is lower than neighboring sites, then we would expect that fatality rate to be lower than if we built it at a neighboring site with higher activity. We also can look at places like stopover sites. We talk about Long Point or Point Keeley with potential migratory stopover sites along the coastline, places that migratory birds and migratory bats may be using. That may also be higher risk areas that could potentially be avoided. I hope that answers the question. Ed, you can chime in as well.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate a little bit. We do have a synthesis paper that's on the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative website. Our friends at West, Jeff Gruber and others, helped with this particular piece of work. As you might imagine, the number of studies that have pre-construction and post-construction fatality data are growing, but they've been pretty scant. And when we started this and originally proposed the question back in 2005 when Dave Riddell and I were kicking this around and others, there was no connection. We heard a lot of people talking about pre-construction, but they had absolutely no connection with post-construction fatality. So that was the objective of that particular piece of work, to try and tie those two ends together, and it's been very difficult. And the current synthesis that we have available and is to be submitted for publication right now has only 15 sites. It doesn't demonstrate a very powerful relationship with much predictive capability at all. So I know Chris has been asking many of you on the call and many of the developers and others to get that data, if you have it available and are willing to share, into the analysis. That, you know, the lack of relationship could be a function of sample size. I personally think it's a ridiculous amount of variability in call activity relative to the fatalities, and it's going to be a pretty messy relationship that I'm not convinced will add a lot of predictive power. So the short answer to the question is it's really hard. And I think, you know, others are working on this and may have more information that needs to be shared and published, but at present, that's kind of where we're at. I think, you know, when you start looking at high concentration areas and, you know, use of radar technology to document emergences of large colonies of maternity roosting bats, those kinds of things, there's some kind of obvious things. But just in the general forested or agricultural landscape, it's proven to be very challenging.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we will follow up with folks whose questions didn't get asked by email afterwards. So thank you, presenters, very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And want to turn it over to Tabor Allison, who's the Director of Research with AWWI, to say a few words before we close out.
Thank you, Lauren. And I want to thank all of you on the phone for attending the webinar, and I want to thank the presenters for their presentations. AWWI is committed to hosting an NWCC webinar series that provides the highest quality scientific reviews on diverse topics from diverse perspectives regarding wind energy and wildlife. We did receive many questions and comments about the presentations, as Lauren indicated, often more than can be covered during the webinar. And we did receive additional questions about Dr. Lovich's presentation that we will be reviewing with Dr. Lovich. AWWI recently released an update of the Wildlife Impact Fact Sheet, and we also produce issue briefs on a variety of specific topics. And we will potentially respond to the questions raised on the webinar through those publications. Finally, AWWI has surveyed the NWCC community to hear your suggestions about this webinar series and other NWCC activities and how we can improve the information that we provide to you. And we have found your responses to be very helpful in planning this and future webinars. And you'll see more of your suggestions reflected in future NWCC activities. So again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great holiday weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, Tabor, and thank you, everyone. Just want to make a quick note about the NWCC Wind Wildlife Research Meeting, which will take place the first weekend of December this year. And this is really, the place to share and hear about the latest research that's been done over the last 2 years since the last meeting. And we hope you all will be able to join us. We've gotten over 100 abstracts submitted and expect it to be a really great meeting. If you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. And we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.